All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on shaping the global growth agenda. My name is Minouche Shafiq, and I'm the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I am joined by an excellent panel to tackle this very big issue. On my immediate left is Berat Albayrak, who is the Minister of Finance of Turkey. Then we have Bill Morneau, the Minister of Finance of Canada, followed by Professor Carmen Reinhart, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and we'll be joined momentarily by Bruno Le Maire, Finance Minister of France. Now, we've all gotten our various updates on the global economic outlook. We know we've got a synchronized slowdown with a possible uptick next year based on the forecasts we've heard from the major international organizations. We also know that there are lots of risks to the downside, and they mainly look geopolitical. There continues to be concern about US-China conflict, the Middle East, trade volumes are slowing, and global value chains are in flux for many, many reasons. And since the financial crisis, most countries have focused on trying to sustain growth and repair their financial systems. And they've achieved that through having very low interest rates and the largest accumulation of debt since the world wars. And because of that, both monetary and fiscal policy are a lot more constrained going forward than they have been in the past. And meanwhile, many would argue that structural reforms, the things that lay the foundations for future growth, be it infrastructure, education, R&D, and more competition, have been relatively neglected in many countries, and hence the very weak productivity growth we see, particularly in the advanced economies. And so the question for today's session is, how do we get sustainable growth back again? And I'm going to start by talking about the debt levels and the debt challenges that we have in many countries. Debt levels are at peacetime highs, and many countries are struggling with the question is, what is a sustainable debt level in this new world of low interest rates? I'm going to start with Carmen, who will give us a sort of aggregate overview, and then I will come to our two finance ministers to give their national perspectives. Carmen.
Well, I think the first observations is both at the advanced economy level and the emerging market level, there's a huge heterogeneity on how close you are to what could be a dangerous level of debt. There's a lot of heterogeneity. But the broad statement that debt levels are much higher than they were a decade ago, I think is actually understated to some degree if one focuses exclusively on the public sector. If one looks at the public sector and said, well, wow, this is the highest levels of debt since World War II. But a big difference in World War II, and this is important for the growth issue that you pose, the growth question that you pose, is at the end of World War II, everybody scaled back on military spending, and the debt looked like a V. It shot up during the war, and then it came down quickly. Now it's a plateau. There's a lot of social programs, things that are very part of the social fabric that they're difficult decisions in a way that they weren't at the end of World War II. And one more observation on where we are today, and this is true for advanced economies in varying degrees and for emerging markets in varying degrees. At the end of World War II, public sector debt was the whole story. That's no longer the case. We have a lot of private sector debt. In some instances, it's the households. In some instances, it's the corporates. In others, the financial sector. But private debt is a big player in a way that it wasn't before historically. And finally, we have the quieter contingent liabilities, which is Social Security. Part of our slowdown is an aging population and the pensions associated with that. So I'm not being overly grim, but I'm just highlighting that the debt situation is much more than saying, aha, look where the public sector is.
Very good. Thank you. Welcome to Minister Bruno Le Maire and the conversation.
Sorry for the delay.
Not at all. It was
we had a negotiation with Secretary Mnuchin. So.
Very good. I'm sure.
On digital taxation.
Well, maybe I'll ask you about that at the end.
It was a good one.
It was a good one.
hope it was
We have
productive.
an agreement, so that's good news.
Fantastic. There you go. Newsflash. Very good. So let me, on the theme of heterogeneity that you mentioned, Carmen, let's start with Turkey, where your debt challenges are very different than some of the other countries that we'll talk about later. Tell us a little bit about how you see sustainable debt evolving in Turkey.
Thank you, Nish, by the way. How I could comment on this, I think this is an interesting point of view. We should divide this into two parts. One, of advanced economies, the other, the emerging economies. I think the overall whole package of the balance sheet, the debt balance sheet, both the government part, the public part, private part, the whole package, it looks very unfortunate for the global economy and the advanced economies, more than 320% to GDP ratios, sustainable or not. I'm very pessimistic on that. How about the emerging ones? Still lower than the advanced economies, which is around 220%. But we are arguing this part, how they're going to, take this into action to recover it, where we need the growth in that phase. I'm going to growth later on, come to growth later on. But in Turkey's position, we are very strong on that one. The whole package, whole balance sheet is a very competitive side. Public part, we have 32% to GDP, almost half of the Maastricht criteria in EU, where the EU average is around 90%. Household, 15%, one of the lowest globally, and more than 90% of it with local currency, no foreign currency attachment. We are in the safe side as well. Banking sector is in good shape as well. The one and only maybe the part of this balance sheet, the private, which is around 65 to 70%, but still comparing to emerging, which is around 95 to 100%, the average emerging private economy. But out of this 65 to 70% of the private, there is a very strategic hint which we need to dig. When I first become the minister, I just would like to see for diving. But before diving, I would like to see the depth of the sea, where I'm going to die, right? It's going to be dangerous when you don't know. So I really seek for the real deal, what's behind it, this 65, 70%. When we look at the detail of the balance sheet of the private sector, since the mid-90s, 95 to till now, 25 years, Turkey's private sector has a very competitive export capacity, 25 years. Most of them, since then, accumulated their profits or revenues outside of Turkey, which is mostly in Europe. Later on, from that moment till today, most of their long-term outside of Turkey lending, we figure out that back to back. Their own money, bring it to Turkey. So they don't have a very fragile balance sheet within that sense. So even though 65 is strong, but most of the 65 is outside lending, outside of Turkey lending is relying on that. So all in all, that strategy of every single country is crucial, especially when we are talking about the growth nowadays in this year's Davos as well, to those countries who have a strong balance sheet, who has real capacity of growth, not only internal market demand, competitive private sector, export capacities, young population, whatever, because this is and less uncertainty will create a much competitive environment for every single country. We do see Turkey as a very positive, advantageous place in that competence.
Okay. Let's turn to Bill. How do you see it in Canada?
Well, as we started, obviously the national situation is quite different from each other. When I look at the debt situation, I look at sort of both risks and opportunities. And when I think about our Canadian situation, I would separate it into our public sector situation, our corporates, and our private individuals. And we're placed in what I would argue is one of the very best positions as a country to take the opportunity to continue to make investments. From the public sector standpoint, we have a low level of debt as a function of our GDP. We're the lowest among the G7 countries. We're less than half the average. So in a very positive situation there. with risks, of course, risks around aging population. But in our context, those risks are managed because we have largely funded pension plans. So our pension plans are funded, both our state pension plans and our private sector pension plans, putting us in a positive situation there without the risk that we see from demographics. Corporates, while I think appropriately said to be one of the areas where we need to pay close attention, our banking sector is very well managed. So we've taken significant risk out of that sector over the course of the last decade. Internationally, Canada was always in a good position there. So I do take a lot of time focusing on the individual issue, on the household debt, which obviously has been exacerbated based on the low interest rates. We've carefully monitored that. The significant percentage of household debt in Canada is debt against housing, and so we've taken measures to make sure that we have assurance that people can actually take on debt appropriately. So from that standpoint, the risk in Canada is relatively well managed, which provides us with the opportunity to continue to do the things that we know we should be doing to have the right balance in our country. So we've been investing at around 1% of GDP in infrastructure and directly into households, so that we can have the fiscal approach that means that our bank is not completely responsible for all of the growth in our country. That's led us to a position where we have continue to have interest rates that are in positive territory, which is positive. And yet we still are reducing that debt as a function of our GDP and the deficit as a function of our GDP each and every year. So we started about a 1% of GDP deficit as a function of GDP and are reducing it. So Canada's in a very strong position. I think looking at the way we've approached this, we have the good fortune of building on a generation ago governments in Canada in the 1990s that addressed a high level of GDP debt as a function of the GDP and put us in a better position today. And our efforts are to continue that investment, take the opportunity that exists so that we can be resilient in the face of challenges in the future. So our fiscal track is a responsible one, leaving us in our situation with significant firepower if those geopolitical risks or these trade tensions that we see cause problems that might not be evident today but could be evident tomorrow. We always need to be prepared for that, and at least we are in a good position both to be resilient in Canada, but also to be an example for how I think other countries can approach this challenging balance of fiscal and monetary policy.
Let me turn to Minister Lemaire. When I was at the IMF, we used to have a sort of, obviously we looked at every country as an individual case, but we had sort of rules of thumb of what sustainable debt would look like. Advanced economies, 80, 90% of GDP you could sort of live with. Emerging markets, 40 to 50, and then you start to get a bit nervous. Do you think what is sustainable has changed in a world of very low interest rates as we currently have in Europe?
I think that's very difficult to define what exactly sustainable debt means. That's like a weather forecast in Ireland, Yeah. It's changing every time under the economic circumstances. But coming to the French situation, I think that we have to make efforts to reduce the level of public debt. And we are all aware of that. Because a high level of public debt is like a poison pill in your national growth. So we are not far from having a level of public debt above around 100%. That's too much. That's, for the largest part, heritage of the past, because over the last 10 years, the public debt has risen from 64% to 97%. But we are in the process of defining the right tools to reduce the level of public debt in France. And we are aware of that. But that's not, I would say, my most important concern. My most important concern is about the current situation of growth within the Eurozone. That's, for all of us, a key question. Because the best way of reducing public debt is not only to reduce the level of public expenses, but to have more growth. And nobody can be satisfied with the level of growth now within the Eurozone, between 1 and 1.2. That's not enough. And we run the risk of entering into a situation where you have low or negative interest rates, low inflation, and low growth. That's not what we want to build for the future of Europe. And that's not what will allow us to face the challenges of new technologies, innovation, and investment. So we are focusing with President Macron on that key question, how to have more growth within the Eurozone. Monetary policy, like Bill explained, is not enough. We have a very good monetary policy, and I think that the recent decisions taken by Christine Lagarde are the right ones. But we need to have also a fiscal policy that would be more ambitious in the countries that do have the fiscal space to do so. We need also to make more investments, to have more innovation, because what is at stake is the ability for Europe to play on the first stage as far as innovation, new technologies and investment are concerned.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to the question of growth and in particular corporates. There has been some criticism of the growth in corporate debt, that it's been primarily about enhancing and making one's balance sheet look prettier rather than actually investing in new ideas. And things like share buybacks and other things have become a major part of what corporate restructuring has been about in recent years. What is your view on corporate debt and whether it's been used to lay the foundations of future growth or whether it's been about other things? And Turkey has some special issues because of the fact that much of it is in foreign exchange, whereas in the other countries, corporates are largely borrowing in their own currency. But Minister, would you like to say something about that?
In fact, Nish, how I could say that? Turkey has a very strong track record of fighting with regional, local crises. And since 2001, 2008, and the recent things that we have been going through all the way in the last 5-6 years, not only trade tensions or global uncertainties, Brexit, whatever, but from the own agenda of Turkey, the regional perspective, and the inside problems that we have been facing through all the way in the last 5-6 years, has learned a lot. Not only the government system or the people on the ground as well, but moreover the private sector as well, to compete with within a very fragile environment is itself. Learned a lot. We have faced Gezi incident in 2013, 14, followed up by 16 coup, and next door, we are neighboring with Iran, Iraq, Syria, you know about it. And then not only fighting with terrorism with names of ISIS, Daesh, PYD, YPG, PKK, whatever, moreover than that. We have witnessed in the last 1.5 years a speculative currency problem outside of Turkey has manipulated our newly arrived system, 2018 presidential system. Overall, when I look at the picture, Turkey has learned a lot. All parties of Turkey has learned a lot. When I compare this last 5 years, 5-6 years to the last decade, 2009 global crisis, Turkey, especially in the last 1 year, has achieved no one could ever expect it. In case of V-shaped recovery, in case of currency stability, in case of export performance level as well. In 2009 crisis, Turkey's export dropped from 132 billion to 102. 30% of export Turkey's shrink. This one, we have reached more than 180 billion, increased 5-10% in some certain level, and first time ever, Turkey's economy registered current account surplus in a year of positive growth. As an emerging economy, it's a unique experience that Turkey achieved. And I'm using this phrase all the time, if it doesn't kill you, makes you stronger perspective. Living in a region, not a popular one, especially nowadays. Turkish private sector has learned a lot in case of production, in case of competitive quality price perspective, integrating their system itself with this competitor. So the thing is, regarding to the growth strategy, growth question, which Bruno raised, I totally agree with him. Rather than debt, the growth is the main concern that we should, because comparing to 10 years ago, the so-called big emerging economies not, registering 5-6% growth. Right now, how about emerging economies? Then the advanced economies, EU and US, 1-2%. Is it survivable? Anyhow. So the thing is, corporate-wise, we have a very competitive base, exporting all varieties of different types of products and countries, and using the significant advantage of the geopolitical positioning of Turkey. Within this framework, this government, last 16 years, hugely invested a lot on infrastructure, transportation, telecommunication, and energy base, which create a very flexible and easy to adapt within the new conditions, global, regional, whatever, to compete in a much better shape for private sector as well.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask Minister Morneau or Minister Le Maire, is there anything on the corporate debt side that you wanted to add?
Well, clearly in an interest rate environment in which we're in, we're going to see that corporate debt, personal debt's going to increase. It's obviously the access to capital together with the price of capital is going to make people have an easier time using debt as opposed to using equity for investments. And so that's understandable. To the extent that we look at that, we want to pay attention to what the outcome is. In our economy, what we're seeing is strong corporate profits. So we are seeing that the outcome is positive in terms of the health of the corporate sector. And we want to try and make sure that those profits then are used in a way that makes most sense. So, Minouche, when you talk about buybacks, we're trying to create appropriate incentives for firms at their level to be putting the money back into their business into appropriate investments. Right. And I think it does mean that as a government, you need to think about that consciously. So we've done a couple things that I think are very helpful. Number one, along with what's happened in the United States, we've made it much more advantageous for corporates to invest in their next investment. We've allowed for accelerated capital cost depreciation, which puts them in a very positive situation for investment. So we've created a strong incentive there. We've also, as a government, identified some key sectors of our economy that we think we have significant, already differential advantage as a country. And we've put in place government investment alongside corporates and universities to try and build continuing advantage in those sectors. So we've said, for example, in the agricultural sector, Canada is very strong. Let's put money into that sector at universities, co-invest along with organizations so we can create additional advantage. And then finally, as a broader economic initiative, we have again made investments into our economy, fiscal investments, because we know that that's a way that we can balance our how we're making sure that our economy continues to grow, so that monetary policy is such that it's not going down to the very, very lowest rate, creating inappropriate incentives and things that might get out of control. So government response, appropriately, we think in our case, has allowed us to keep the corporate challenge under wraps, and our banking, our macroprudential policy has also been strong to make sure that we're not taking undue risks from that regard. So you have to worry about everything as a finance minister. In terms of corporate debts, this is not the number one. I would spend time worrying a lot about individual debt, even before that, but you need to pay attention to everything.
Mr. Le Maire, anything else?
I fully share the point of view of Bill. I think if you have to make a ranking between the different levels of debt, I think that the public debt is the first question. No. The individual debt is the second one, because this might be a risk for our citizen, and the corporate debt would be the third one. First of all, because we have rules, we have a monitoring process to be sure that this level of debt remains on control and does not get out of control. And also because we are putting in place, like Canada, incentives to be sure that this money goes to the real economy and will be invested in the key choices that we are making with the French government, for instance, on renewable energies, innovation, and new technologies.
Very good. Professor Reinhardt, anything you want to add?
So first, I want to make sure the audience understands that you don't have to be a finance minister to worry. I mean, studying crises, it's always easier to spot bubbles in the rearview mirror. So what I'm going to say are, what are some of the 3 issues on corporate debt that I find of concern? This is not a prediction that a crisis is around the corner or anything like that, but what are 3 issues that are of concern? Well, number 1, I would say some of those concerns have eased in recent months, but if you looked at the collateralized loan obligation market in the United States, it had some elements that were too reminiscent of the subprime crisis. Specifically, you had a staggered deterioration in the quality of borrowers. So the initial collateralized loan obligations, CLOs, tended to be of higher quality than those that came later, which was true also, by the way, of the subprime crisis. The initial subprime mortgages were higher quality than those that came later, and that process did not end too well. The second commonality with the subprime, apart from lower quality, was also that many of these collateralized loan obligations had very lax covenants in terms of contracts. And the third was that there was a lot of foreign buying. For example, Japanese banks were buying collateralized loan obligations in substantive qualities. And some of these issues are, you begin to wonder, is the drive for, given the extremely low rate environment, given negative interest rates in Japan, given negative interest rates in Europe, is this low interest rate environment once again behind the search for yield? Yeah. And so that's one issue on corporate. The second, very quickly, is corporate balance sheets look a lot better when equity prices are at all-time highs. Yeah. Than when equity prices are a lot lower. And so if you take any of the, Merton distance to default models, a decline in equity prices would have bearing on corporate balance sheets. That's not to be trifled with. And third and last, turning to emerging markets. The low rate environment, again, has very much stimulated a search for yield. Part of the search for yield hasn't been just things like CLO and high yield in advanced economies, but also emerging market debt. And corporates, in varying degrees, it's a blanket statement. In some countries, corporate debt is not an issue, but in varying degrees, there is, on the whole, in emerging markets, a lot more external corporate foreign currency debt today than there was 10 years ago, which makes it vulnerable to, a strong dollar and so on.
Okay, let me turn to the macroeconomics of growth at the moment, and I'm going to start with Minister Le Maire this time. There's a lot of talk about central banks having limited room to maneuver in the low interest rate environment we're in. I don't believe they've got no room to maneuver, but limited. So all eyes are now shifting to fiscal policy and to what fiscal policy can do. Fiscal policy, too, is constrained relative to where we were 10 years ago, but that's where the focus has been. I think there's also a worry that if central banks go any further, anything more they might do starts to look a lot like fiscal policy and therefore would threaten their independence. And wouldn't it be better if fiscal authorities did those things rather than central banks did those things? Where do you see that going? And how much do you think fiscal should be doing, and what does it mean for the independence of central banks going forward?
I strongly believe in the independence of central banks. So I will never criticize the decisions taken by the central bank, because this is a question of credibility and a matter of credibility for all the Eurozone. But once again, let's look at the situation as it stands. The average level of growth within the Eurozone is 1%, 1.2%. That's not enough. I could be satisfied as the French Minister of Finance and Economy that for the first time, France is doing well. We have a level of growth of around 1.3%, above the average level of growth within the Eurozone. That's good news for us. That's not good news for the Eurozone. Because Eurozone cannot be successful if it only provides stability. It must also provide prosperity for all the citizens. So now we have to think about new tools to complete what has been already done by the monetary policy. As you just said, I think that the margin of maneuver for the monetary policy is right now a very limited one, a very thin one. So let's think about new instruments. And let's think about a coordinated approach among the 19 members of the Eurozone. There are some member states that have to introduce new reforms for the sake of being more competitive and to have a better level of productivity. It's the case for France. And that's exactly what we have done with President Macron from the very beginning. We have introduced huge reforms on key topics. For instance, on the question of the taxation with a total overhaul of the French taxation system, with a very strong reduction of the level of taxation of capital. We have also introduced a total overhaul of the labor market, and we are on the verge of introducing a new structural reform on pensions. We are doing the job. So we are waiting for other member states of the Eurozone to do their homework too. There are some member states, like Germany or the Netherlands, that do have the necessary fiscal space to use the fiscal instrument. We are waiting for Germany and the Netherlands and all the countries that do have the necessary fiscal space to use that fiscal space to feed growth in their own country and everywhere within the Eurozone. Otherwise, we run the risk of having a slowdown within the whole Eurozone, with the possibility for countries that do not have the fiscal space to use the fiscal instrument because the other ones are not using that instrument.
Yep.
My last point is that we should also think about the question of incomes and incomes policy. Never forget that we are facing difficult political times. And this is not only the Yellow Jacket movement. Everywhere in Europe, you are facing a rise of populist parties. Because that's not the single reason, but one of the most important reasons is the lack of prosperity, the level of incomes that is not enough to have a decent life with your life. You have to address that issue. And I think that all of us, I mean all the 19 members of the Eurozone, should also think about what is a decent income that makes your life better and that provides unity among the society.
Thank you. Let me turn to Turkey, where the balance between monetary and fiscal has been in flux. There have been questions about central bank independence in Turkey. How do you see that going forward?
No, any other in a country, no other world, what we do see that allows high interest rates, by the way. This is the reality of life. But there's another reality that you need to align with the free market economy conditions. The thing is, what Turkey faced so far, other than those struggles, we have witnessed almost 8 elections in the last 5 years. And thankfully, we ended up switching to the new system, monetary fiscal policy alignment under the specific one ministerial area, and independency of, for sure, central bank. But this time, what makes it different, especially struggling with this 1.5 year, we have shoved this. Is this the only thing that the obligation of one of the responsibilities of central banks, the price stability for Turkey? No. It has to be also financial stability as well. Because as an emerging economy, you have to grow. You have to find jobs. You have to make investment. You have to create this environment to increase the GDP per capita, because you have what it takes to 2 P's of growth, just like Turkey, production and population. We have a strong base on population, right? 1.3, 1.5%. Average every year, 2-3% coming from there. And production, we have a very competitive private sector, investing, exporting, producing, whatsoever. So we need to create that environment within the central banks, price stability, financial stability, monetary policy, coordination, responsibility, plus the fiscal policy side, the government, which we have a strong balance sheet. We have to be in the market, incentive side, tax side, taxation side, or other package that we should create these reform agenda, which unfortunately we couldn't make it, especially in the election season, 8 election season, you could make it. But thankfully, with no more elections for the coming 4 years, we have created this environment in the last 1 year within the help of the new system, which we ended up, the capacity performance of this new systems has shown a significant result in CDS of Turkey, more than 350% basis points. Interest rates, inflation, used to be 25-30%, right now 10-11%, and you're expecting stable single digit this year, 2020. And inflation affecting the interest rates for sure, and emerging economy, it's a killing double-digit interest rates. For sure, we ended up single digits again, and it's also helping and recovering on that side as well. So the thing is, the idea, if you're aiming the same target within a coordinated and synchronized point of view, for sure, implementation, instrument, whatever tools you're using, you are independent. But you have to aim for the same target in that sense. The first time ever in Turkey, those institutions that we have talked, including central bank, all of whatsoever. And I'm giving that specific example, how independent in Turkey, I'm saying that as independent as Fed, by the way, in Turkey. So the thing is, we are really making a strong change within this global competitive environment.
Okay. Let me, just in the interest of time, jump to my final question, which is, what should the growth agenda be going forward? Now, a huge part of it is national. I think Minister Lemaire is reminding us the best way to make debt sustainable is to grow. That's a lot easier than trying to reduce actual debt levels. I'd like each of the panelists to say a little bit about what the priorities are. Much of the growth agenda is national, but there's also a part of it that's international. And if they could particularly speak to what should the G20 be doing in terms of revitalizing global growth. And maybe I'm going to start with Professor Reinhardt to just give us a slightly historical perspective on how countries have been able to grow out of debt in the past. And then I'll ask the ministers to give us their views.
I really do not envy the gentleman in this group because there are growth headwinds. There's demographics, which it's not something that you certainly change overnight. And then we are in a productivity slump. And I can say this at a fairly aggregate level, especially the advanced economies are faced with the challenge that, you know, there's optimistic views and very negative views. More negative views say the best technological advances are behind us, so don't expect too much on future productivity growth. And the more upbeat assessment is that we are in this plateau in which the new technology hasn't yet kicked in, and we could be on the cusp of another productivity surge. But the bottom line is that productivity growth has been, you know, historically very weak. So what do you do in that environment? And that is, I think, your question. Well, as much as I am someone who does not take a benign view of debt, I do think this is a reasonable strategy is to use the low interest rate environment for furthering productive investment, public investment projects. Now, I don't say this with abandon, meaning emphasis on productive. shovel-ready projects in the United States that are productive are few and far between. So I think productivity is something that has to factor in. And secondly, I do think that something that may not yield immediate dividends, but I think has the element of confidence and adds to growth over the longer term, is for coming to terms with some of the unfunded pension issues. This is, again, highly varied from country to country, but the aging population, the Social Security safety nets loom large. And I will limit myself to tackling those two issues, neither of which are obviously easy.
Minister Murnau, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Well, you asked two questions, what we should be doing nationally and what we can do at the G20 to have a coordinated approach. And nationally, I think we've talked about it. I think I really start off where Bruno ended his last comment, is we do need to think about how we give a sense of confidence and optimism to our population, to our people. And that means thinking about what is driving the populism. And it's a sense of unequal rewards. It's a sense of opportunities for the future. So as we think about appropriately investing, and we happen to be in a very good position in terms of our debt as a function of our economy, we want to invest in those long-term productive enhancing opportunities like infrastructure. But we want to invest directly also in people. So invest in families. We've put money into families by giving benefits that work. Invest in worker retraining so people can continually upgrade their skills. These are going to have short-term optimistic advantages and long-term opportunities for increased productivity in our society. At the G20 level, it's a little bit more challenging. We need to think about what are the enablers for that to happen internationally. We can obviously talk about best practices, both when France was leading the G7, when Canada was leading the G7. We talked about the things that we can be doing within our economies and shared best practices. That's something that the G20 can do, but our situations are quite different. We can continue to think about the things that will make more advantage. So talking about trade irritants is a regular G20 issue. Obviously, we're in a pretty difficult situation around trade over the last few years, so we're trying constantly to enable more success in that regard. We need to think about risks. We need to think about cyber risks, which can derail our problems. We need to think about anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, things that we can work together on that will take away those risks that will create significant challenges against growth. So the G20 has a role to play in all those things, as well as ensuring that there's fairness in our societies. So the digital tax issue that Bruno started off talking about is the sort of thing that we do need to attack at the G20 level, because if our people don't feel like there's a fairness to the system, then they don't want to be actively engaged in growth. So there are things we need to do nationally, the appropriate balance between our fiscal investments and our prudence, because we need to be resilient in the face of challenge. We are very carefully managing down our debt as a function of our economy while making investments. But we start from a very good position, so we can do that. And then we need to work together on the things that will reduce our risks. And that's what we'll continue to be engaged in at the G20.
Very good. Minister, briefly, anything you want to add to what Minister Murnau said?
I agree both of the comments, but how I could say that at the beginning inside, what makes me concerned about the global framework that I could at that? Uncertainty is getting much bigger and bigger concern that we have expected. Comparing to 2009 till now, this things going on right now. New policy missteps we are hearing every single day. And it's getting much, much bigger uncertainty on the ground. And everybody, every single country in the world, try to find their own solution, our methodology, which is not helping, not the growth, but stability, but moreover than that. The thing is, it's a time of, okay, we are not in the same page in 2009. At G20, there are more coordination, not only policy, but, economical perspective or global political agenda. We are very much aligned in 2009. Right now, it's very much fragmented. We all know about it. The thing is, it's a time of new trade agreements, you could say so far, even it's bilateral or some other perspective. It's a time of rational political point of view. Leadership should need it to see much more certainty than uncertainty, to get rid of this all clashes, potential clashes in our head, which will definitely negatively affect the global growth as well.
Minister, may I give you the last word?
It will not be the last word, but first of all, I would make a distinction between what I would call the forced expenses and the new choices that the governments have to make. The forced expenses, referring to what you just said and that I fully share, are due to the aging population and the new technologies in health that are very costly. The result of that, because of course we are in charge of the society, is that there will be more public expenses that are forced expenses, otherwise we run the risk of jeopardizing and undermining our social model. Yeah. So we have to be aware of that. We will need more public expenses for an aging population and to fund those new technologies in health that are very costly. And then you have the new choices that governments can make. And the choice that we are making in France, and that will be done also in Europe, is very simple. Innovation, innovation, innovation. You know, we are in the process in France of building what we call a pacte productif, a pact for productivity. And we are assessing the markets, the technologies in which we want to invest to be successful in the next decade, I would say. Because we are aware that we should avoid having expenses in all the fields. We have to make choices depending on the situation of the market and the technologies that France is ready to master. One example, hydrogen. Hydrogen will be one of the key technologies in which France will put a lot of public money because we think that there is a market, there are the technologies, and this can be efficient for the French economy. And my last point is about the global purpose, the political purpose that we want to present to our society. I think that if the single purpose we are presenting is to have more productivity or to make more profits, we won't convince a large part of our society. And we will never convince the youngest part of the society. We need to be clear that we are doing those efforts for the sake of having a better life, a more inclusive society, and a more sustainable growth.
Very good, thank you. I will close, and my apologies we didn't have time for questions, but I think the conversation was excellent. And with just two thoughts, really. I think the eyes of the world are on finance ministers these days to deliver global growth. And so the burden of responsibility on you all is very heavy. And if finance ministers make wise choices about the use of the fiscal space that they have, it has the potential really to make this decade a decade of recovery for the world economy. I think for the G20, I used to always joke that the G20 is a bit like a tea bag. It only works when it's in hot water. I would say the water is lukewarm at the moment. So galvanizing collective action at the G20 is unlikely, but there is still an important agenda that will unblock the ability for good national policies at this time. And I would very much hope that we see that progress in the years ahead. Thank you to our excellent panelists for a very good discussion. Thank you for the audience.